All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well. If I'm audible, please let me know. Good morning, Pratik. आवाज आ रही है ना? Good morning. Right. So, as discussed in our previous lecture, today we have to start with the 19th century socio-religious reform movements. Now, the socio-religious reform movements are a very important turning point in modern Indian history because this is what actually started the process of the real modernization of India. Earlier, historians also used to refer to it as the Indian Renaissance or the Bengal Renaissance. Okay? So, in their estimation, the impact that the European Renaissance had on the European society and culture, the European state machinery, as well as the relationship between the society, state, and the church, similar kind of impact these 19th century socio-religious reform movements had on India and its people. Renaissance in Europe was the starting of the process of modernization of Europe, ending of the medieval age, beginning of the modern age. Similarly, in a real sense, on the ground level, the people of India started actually modernizing themselves from the 19th century onwards under the leadership of these movements and their leaders. ठीक है? तो क्या था ये सोशल रिलीजियस रिफॉर्म मूवमेंट्स? What was its objective? To reform the Indian society, to modernize the Indian society, to heal the fractures which were keeping the Indians divided, and to give a civilizational response to the modern West, which had very clearly defeated the old Indian civilization, had proven itself to be superior, and had led to the enslavement of the Indians at the hands of a small foreign company, leading to the degeneration of the Indian economy and a great amount of misery being dealt upon to the Indian people. So, in a sense, it was also a response to Western colonialism. ठीक है? Purpose क्या था इन social religious reform movements का? As the name suggests, to reform the social as well as religious machinery which governed India and Indians. ठीक है? Now, इसको हमें प्राइमरीली 4 eyes के थ्रू डिस्कस करना है. What are these 4 eyes? First of all, what were the issues that were involved? What were the problems that these 19th century reformers were trying to solve? Second eye, the ideas that were responsible for triggering this drive towards change and how those ideas spread across India. Okay? Thirdly, the individuals and their institutions. So, who were the prominent leaders among these 19th century reformers? What were the organizations, the institutions that they created? What impact did these have? What did they advocate for? What were the works that they did? ये सारी चीजें हमको cover करनी है. And finally, the fourth eye, that is the impact of these रिफॉर्म मूवमेंट्स. ठीक है? तो इन 4 आईज के थ्रू हमें ये पूरा टॉपिक कवर करना है. ऑब्वियसली if you are going to start and count the number of social religious reformers, the number would be more than 200. institutions भी more than 200 होंगे, but we are obviously not going to cover all of them. हम उसमें से जो सबसे prominent वाले होंगे उनको individually cover करेंगे. So there are 6 names which are going to be most prominently featured in any list of previous years UPSC questions. कौन कौन है usual suspects? राजा राम मोहन रॉय, सर सैयद अहमद खान, दयानंद सरस्वती, दी वहाबी मूवमेंट, ज्योतिबा फूले एंड स्वामी विवेकानंद. तो इन 6 इंडिविजुअल्स को हम अलग से कवर करेंगे. But while discussing the impact of the 19th century socio-religious reform movements, we are going to cover some more of them. तो उनको tangentially हम mention करेंगे, specifically उनके बारे में discuss नहीं करेंगे. Now, before we do any of this, a small introduction. Right? Within which you can write the 19th century. The 19th century marked the beginning of a new chapter in Indian history, which stood for its cultural and social rejuvenation. Its cultural and social rejuvenation. Next point. This intellectual stirring, stirring, was triggered by A and B. The impact of Western culture, and B, the consciousness of defeat to the West. Right? So some Indians who came face to face with Western culture could appreciate its advantages, could see the benefits of the Western civilization. They also wanted to emulate to a certain degree the strength, efficiency, as well as the unity of the West as compared to India. Secondly, they could also tangibly feel the consciousness of having been defeated by the West. India had succumbed to a small foreign power, not in fact even a nation state, but rather a foreign trading company. So obviously the Indian intellectuals are now going to question कि भाई ऐसा हो कैसे सकता है? How could such a thing come to pass that a whole civilization, an ancient civilization, a magnificent civilization would so suddenly and easily succumb to a small Western power, right? And this process of questioning drove them towards reform. They understood that the civilizational machinery of India was somehow broken. अब उसको fix करने की जरूरत है, right? So this is what drove this intellectual stirring, which stood for the cultural and social rejuvenation of India. Is this much clear? Next point likho. The Indian intellectuals differed in their approach as well as the degree of reform. Differed in their approach as well as the degree of reform. But all of them appreciated the urgency of the need for reform. Appreciated the urgency for the need for reform. ठीक है, तो हर इंडिविजुअल रिफॉर्मर का अप्रोच अलग अलग होता था. तो एवरीबडी अंडरस्टूड दैट द इंडियन सिविलाइजेशनल मशीनरी वाज ब्रोकन, इट नीडेड टू बी रिजुविनेटेड. लेकिन अप्रोच क्या यूज किया जाए? शुड द ओल्ड मॉडल बी रिवाइव्ड, शुड इट बी रिपेयर्ड, or should it be replaced by something entirely new? Should Indian society openly and freely adopt the Western customs, the Western culture? Should itself become westernized? Or should the civilizational machinery of ancient India be rejuvenated? जो उसका ओरिजिनल फॉर्म था उसमें वापस लाना चाहिए. जो उसके डिफॉर्मिटीज इंट्रोड्यूस हो गई हैं ओवर टाइम, should they be replaced, should they be removed, or should a completely new model be introduced? तो अप्रोच अलग अलग होता था. सेकंड क्वेश्चन वाज कि किस डिग्री तक इंडियन सोसाइटी उन रिफॉर्म्स को, उन रिपेयर्स को एक्सेप्ट कर सकता है. At what point will it be rejected by the Indian society? That was also a very important question. क्योंकि आप सडनली अगर बहुत स्वीपिंग रिफॉर्म्स लेके आ जाते हैं, completely transforming the structure of the society and the state, then people are going to reject it. There is going to be a great degree of friction. Adapt नहीं कर पाएंगे. जो रिफॉर्म का विजन है, that is not going to be transmitted with great degree of fidelity. That was the next question. तो इसमें डिफरेंसेस रहेंगे, बट ऑल द इंडियन रिफॉर्मर्स अंडरस्टूड दैट भाई मशीनरी ब्रोकन है और कुछ ना कुछ करना जरूरी है. थिंग्स कैन नॉट बी लेफ्ट टू स्टैंड एज दे वर. ठीक है, इतना. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो, राइट डाउन. The reformers also understood, the reformers also understood that reforming the society without reforming religion would be impossible. Would be impossible. एंड क्यों है ऐसा? क्योंकि सिविलाइजेशनल सॉफ्टवेयर में जो मैलवेयर था, जो वायरस था, सबके पीछे रिलीजन था. ऑल द सोशल इविल्स दैट वर प्रेवलेंट इन द सोसाइटी वर एंजॉयिंग रिलीजियस सैंक्शन. फॉर एग्जांपल, अनटचेबिलिटी का भी एक रिलीजियस एक्सप्लेनेशन बैकग्राउंड दिया गया था. पर्दा सिस्टम का भी रिलीजियस फैक्टर इन्वॉल्व था. द इनएबिलिटी ऑफ वुमेन टू रिसीव एजुकेशन, टू एंटर पब्लिक लाइफ, उसके पीछे भी रिलीजियस सैंक्शन था. द सुपरस्टिशंस प्रिवेलिंग विद इन द सोसाइटी often had religious backing. जो religious class of elites था, जो चाहे मौलवीज हो जाए, चाहे पंडित्स हो जाए, they were the ones who were actually reinforcing all these beliefs and practices, right? So without reforming religion, it would have been virtually impossible to reform the Indian society. Write down. This was because many of the evils plaguing Indian society were sanctioned by religion. sanctioned by religion. In fact, religion had been the traditional basis of creating and enforcing social norms, in India. ठीक है? So that is why without addressing religion, reforming the society would have been impossible. Is this much clear? Next point लिखो. Thus, the 19th century socio-religious reform movements 19th century socio-religious reform movements essentially sought to modernize the Indian society. In order to equip it with the tools to address the Western challenge. ठीक है? So within these socio-religious reform movements, you are also going to find the roots of nationalism, because these 19th century socio-religious reformers were thinking in terms of a competition between the Western civilization and the Indian civilization. तो उस Indian civilization में जो Indian वाला content है, that is definitely inspired by the ideology of nationalism. And secondly, these reformers were also responding to the Western challenge. The Western society had already organized itself on the basis of nation states. So their struggle was not only against some anomalous idea of the Western challenge, but a definite response to British imperialism. The British nation state had been responsible for the exploitation and enslavement of India over the previous century, and it was the response of the Indians to address this British challenge. ठीक है? तो सब पॉइंट लिखो. Since this reform movement was envisioned within the framework of a clash of modern Western nationalistic imperialism and India's native civilization, comma, the roots of Indian nationalism were actually present within this movement. Next subpoint. In fact, many prominent historians consider these movements consider these movements to be the social and cultural roots, the social and cultural roots of Indian nationalism. ठीक है, देखो इसमें बोला क्या गया है, एक बार समझ लो इसको. Nationalism essentially है क्या? It is an ideology. What kind of an ideology? A political ideology. What does it stand for? It stands for the expression of shared political aspirations by a group of people who believe that they belong to a common group. ठीक है, and thus they have shared political interests. Now, this consciousness of belonging to the same common group is actually the root of nationalism. In fact, it is the rule of all political activity. Now, in the case of Western countries, countries such as Britain or France or let us say Portugal, Spain, etc., what was the basis of their common identity? A shared history, a shared culture, but most importantly, a common language. That means people belonging to the same linguistic group would organize themselves along the same national lines, along distinct national lines, resulting in the emergence of different nation states across the length and breadth of Europe. So Italy for Italians, Spain for the Spanish, France for the French, and Germany for the Germans. ये पैटर्न इमर्ज हुआ. इंडिया में दिक्कत क्या था? इंडिया में कोई एक शेयर्ड आइडेंटिटी था नहीं. तो ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ लैंग्वेज और कास्ट और रिलीजन, to cobble together, to unite the Indians would have been very difficult proposition, right? And thus an alternative approach was needed in order to convince Indians from across the subcontinent that they belong to the same common group, that they are part of a single nation. तो इस अप्रोच में किसके ऊपर एम्फेसिस होगा? अपॉन सोशल एंड कल्चरल यूनिटी. ठीक है, एंड दिस social and cultural unification was achieved to a certain degree, at least, by the 19th century socio-religious reformers. Indian society was highly fractured. Indians were divided deeply against each other on the basis of their religion, caste, gender, etc. Several evils were also prevalent within the society, which made this division even more complex, because the pattern of Indian society was that it ended up creating two separate classes of people in most situations. One would be the exploiter class, the other would be the exploited class. And दोनों के बीच में unity naturally नहीं emerge होगा. So that would have to be artificially induced. How? By bringing down the barriers which were keeping the Indians divided, by fostering a sense of unity, fostering a sense of commonality and shared interests, right? So ये जो process of social and cultural unification है, that was the most important first step towards creating the consciousness among Indians that they belong to a common group. So that is what we have been emphasizing in our previous point. Clear है इतना? आगे बढ़े. तो ये हो गया एक छोटा सा इंट्रोडक्शन, एक ओवरव्यू आपको मिल गया है अबाउट दीज 19th सेंचुरी सोशल रिफॉर्मर्स. पहला आई क्या था? इश्यूज. What were the problems with 19th century Indian society that these reformers were trying to address? बताइए, किस तरह के प्रॉब्लम्स या इविल्स प्रिवेल करते थे इंडियन सोसाइटी में? हाँ, ठीक है, बताओ बताओ, एक एक करके बताओ. इविल्स प्रिवेलिंग इन द सोसाइटी. एजुकेशन से रिलेटेड प्रॉब्लम्स जैसे कि the exclusion of several groups from the access to education, such as women, the lower castes, etc., tribals, इन सबको access ही नहीं था. और क्या प्रॉब्लम? वही जो लोअर कास्ट है उनको एक्सेस नहीं मिलता था. ये तो ठीक है, एक एक्सेस का प्रॉब्लम हो गया. दैट एक्सेस वाज नॉट फ्री एंड इक्वल. इसके अलावा इंडियन एजुकेशन 19th सेंचुरी में जो ट्रेडिशनल इंडियन एजुकेशन था, चाहे वो गुरुकुल में दिया जा रहा है, मदरसा में दिया जा रहा है, कोई और प्रॉब्लम था उसमें? हाँ, सिस्टम बहुत रिजिड था और बहुत आउटडेटेड था. वो सिस्टम डिजाइन किया गया था 1500-2000 साल पहले, और तब से इन एन ऑलमोस्ट अनचेंज्ड मेथोडोलॉजी वही वाले जो पहले की एक्टिविटीज थी वो परस्यू हो रही थी. विद टाइम, as the times change, as economic changes take place, the education methodologies needs to renew itself, needs to evolve in order to keep up with the times. बट इंडियन जो एजुकेशनल सिस्टम से देवर आउटडेटेड, सिलेबस भी आउटडेटेड था, अप्रोच भी आउटडेटेड था. ठीक है, तो प्रॉब्लम्स रिलेटेड टू एजुकेशन एक सेट ऑफ प्रॉब्लम्स हो गए. और बताओ, और किस तरह के प्रॉब्लम्स एनविजिज कर सकते हो आप? सोशल प्रॉब्लम्स. अच्छा, विडो रीमैरिजेस और सती का प्रॉब्लम, चाइल्ड मैरिज का प्रॉब्लम, फीमेल इन्फेंटिसाइड का प्रॉब्लम, पर्दा का प्रॉब्लम, lack of or inability of women to enter public life, religious disabilities being imposed upon women, they are not allowed to participate in religious practices, etc. तो एक तो इस तरह के प्रॉब्लम हो गए. बट जब सोशल प्रॉब्लम्स बोलते हैं ना, तो वो बहुत वाइड हो जाता है. तो उसमें जो विमेन्स वाले इश्यूज हैं, दैट इज अ सबसेट ऑफ द सोशल प्रॉब्लम्स, राइट? तो सोशल प्रॉब्लम्स की जगह पहले हम बोलते हैं विमेन्स इश्यूज, एंड दूसरा बोलेंगे कास्ट रिलेटेड इश्यूज. ठीक है, अब देखो, they were important to address not only because of the intrinsic benefits that could have been brought to Indian society because of them. ये women के issues अगर हम address कर देते हैं, we'll be addressing the issues of roughly 50% of the entire population, and it is an injustice to keep 50% of the population permanently subordinated to the rest. Similarly, by addressing the caste related problems, we can make a big step forward in the process of this cultural and social unification. But the 19th century social reformers were not simply trying to reform the Indian society, they were also trying to respond to the Western critics of Indian society. Western critics, for example, colonial scholars, इंडियन सोसाइटी को बहुत बिटरली क्रिटिसाइज करते थे. दैट सी women are treated so poorly, how does India treat its lower classes, and British rule is necessary in India because we are actually looking to reform the women's problems, we are trying to address the problems of the lower castes. It is only the modern West and a government which believes in the modern Western ideology which can address, which can make a dent into these problems, right? So Indians के लिए to make the case for self governance, it was also important कि इन ग्रुप्स के जो मेजर इश्यूज हैं उनको खुद से एड्रेस करें. so that Indians can come on to the moral high ground. Abhi to they do not have any defense against the Western criticism. But if Indians themselves start to reform the society, then the West is going to lose a major rod that it is holding against the Indian civilization. That Indians deserve to be ruled by the West because they cannot rule themselves well. देखो खुद से रूल करने का नतीजा क्या हुआ है. ये उनके हाथ से छड़ी निकल जाएगी एंड इंडियंस वुड बी एबल टू गो ऑन दी ऑफेंसिव. जब तक दूसरे के हाथ में छड़ी है आप अपने आप को डिफेंड करते हो, अटैक नहीं करते हो, राइट? सो दैट इज ऑल्सो व्हाट दे वर ट्राइंग टू एड्रेस. तो दोनों चीजें इससे एड्रेस. एंड फाइनली वी हैव द superstitious beliefs and practices, right? Now, superstitious beliefs and practices में there is going to be a long list of beliefs and practices. अब एक एक को individually हम नहीं address करने वाले हैं, but एक group की तरह address कर सकते हैं. Can you give some examples of common superstitions? विच हंटिंग वाज नॉट अ प्रॉब्लम जो कि इंडिया में था, वो अमेरिका का प्रॉब्लम था प्राइमरली और यूरोप का प्रॉब्लम था. तो एंड दैट वाज आल्सो मच बिफोर दिस पीरियड ऑफ 14 से 16 सेंचुरी में प्राइमरली हुआ, राइट? उसके बाद से जब से एनलाइटनमेंट आया तब से रिड्यूस होने लग गया. सम आइसोलेटेड इंसिडेंट्स टुक प्लेस इन द 17th सेंचुरी इन अमेरिका, लेकिन उसके भी अपने खुद के कई सारे रीजंस हैं. इंडिया में इतना बड़ा प्रॉब्लम विच हंटिंग वाला नहीं हुआ करता था. इंडिया में सुपरस्टिशंस कई तरह के हो सकते थे. कई बहुत हार्मफुल भी होते थे, बट कई हार्मलेस भी होते थे. हार्मफुल वाले फॉर एग्जांपल ह्यूमन सैक्रिफाइस, कि बच्चे की बलि चढ़ा देना क्योंकि ये बिलीफ है दैट इन रिटर्न वी आर गोइंग टू गेट समथिंग. देन अनदर वेरी हार्मफुल वन, वो जो मांगलिक वाला सिस्टम है, राइट? देन अनदर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट हार्मफुल सुपरस्टिशन was the prohibition against Indians traveling abroad. So this confined Indians within the subcontinent. It reduced their connection to the West, their contact with the other parts of the world, and made Indians inward looking. तो उसके long term effect जो है काफी disastrous रहे. कुछ harmless वाले होते हैं, for example बिल्ली रास्ता काट के चले गए तो you should not pass through that way. अगर कोई सीढ़ी लगी हुई है, don't pass under that. नॉट क्लिपिंग योर नेल्स एट नाइट, इस तरह के सुपरस्टिशंस जो आज भी कई लोग ऑब्जर्व करते हैं, राइट? माय क्वेश्चन इज कि रिगार्डलेस ऑफ वेदर दे आर हार्मफुल और harmless, the very presence of such kinds of superstitious beliefs and practices tells you something about the people who believe in these things. क्या बताता है आपको उनके बारे में? Are they very open-minded, free-thinking, rational individuals? Or are they people who do not like to think for themselves? Are they people who are intellectually lazy, or those who have been indoctrinated not to question any established beliefs? दूसरे कैटेगरी के तो फ्री थिंकिंग वाले तो नहीं है, राइट? दीज आर पीपल हु हैव बीन ट्रेन्ड टू लिसन टू फिगर्स ऑफ अथॉरिटी, कि फलाने पंडित जी ने ये बोल दिया, फलाने मौलवी साहब ने ये बोल दिया, दादा दादी ऐसा मानते थे, वो उसको मान लेंगे. दे आर गोइंग टू internalize that, and they are not going to challenge it or defile those norms at an instinctual level. तो उनका basic instinct होगा उसको follow करने का. This kind of deferment to let us say authority is very harmful for the society. क्यों? क्योंकि ये critical thinking को एकदम strangulate कर देता है. And critical thinking is that thing which allows individuals present within the society to question things that are harmful for the society as a whole and to them individually. और जब तक क्वेश्चन नहीं करोगे तब तक कभी चेंज आ सकता है? नहीं आ सकता है. सो सुपरस्टिशन इज बोथ अ सिम्टम ऑफ as well as a cause of social stagnation. ठीक है? सो ये चार इश्यूज हैं प्राइमरीली. हमने इनको बंच कर दिया है. इश्यूज रिलेटेड टू एजुकेशन, विमेन्स इश्यूज, कास्ट रिलेटेड इश्यूज एंड सुपरस्टिशियस बिलीफ्स एंड प्रैक्टिसेस that the 19th century reformers tried most ardently to address. ठीक है? थोड़ा थोड़ा लिख लेते हैं एक एक करके. नंबर 1, issues related to education. Issues related to education. Write down. Indian education was highly discriminatory. Since women and the lower castes did not have any access. Women and the lower castes did not have any access. Full stop. Only a small section of upper caste men, only a small section of upper caste men were in a position to receive education. Full stop. What was the result of this? सोसाइटी और इकोनॉमी में इसकी वजह से इक्वालिटी होगा या इनइक्वालिटी बढ़ेगा? इनइक्वालिटी बढ़ेगा. सो राइट डाउन, दिस रिजल्टेड इन sharp socio-economic division. Sharp socio-economic division of the society. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट इसी एजुकेटेड प्रॉब्लम्स में, एजुकेशनल प्रॉब्लम्स में लिखो. फर्दर, traditional Indian education was also highly outdated. Full stop. It emphasized upon the reading of religious scripture, along with an outdated syllabus of traditional science, medicine, law, philosophy, and mathematics. Full stop. This outdated curriculum did not prepare students to participate in the quickly transforming modern world. ठीक है. So these were the two major problems associated with Indian education. Second लिखो, women's issues. Write down. Women were subjected to a series of evils and restrictions, such as evils and restrictions, such as sati, child marriage, female infanticide, parda, polygamy, religious disabilities, restriction on education and economic participation, etc. Full stop. Next point. This had resulted in half of India's population being reduced to a silent spectator in the civilizational story. Full stop. Women were actively prevented from contributing to the process of socio-economic, cultural, and political creation. Full stop. In other words, the Indian civilization had deliberately sabotaged itself by depriving it by depriving itself by depriving itself huh, by depriving itself had deliberately sabotaged itself by depriving itself of the female genius. Next point. Further, the mistreatment of women was exposing the Indian civilization to bitter criticism from the West. Full stop. Western intellectuals justified the colonization of India on the grounds of defending the honor within quotes, on the grounds of defending the honor of Indian women. Full stop. Next point. Therefore, addressing the issues faced by women was of immense social as well as political importance. Social as well as political importance. ठीक है, समझ में आया ना इतना? ये हो गए विमेन्स इश्यूज. थर्ड राइट, कास्ट रिलेटेड इश्यूज. कास्ट रिलेटेड इश्यूज. Write down. These include untouchability, comma, discrimination in matters of education and employment, comma, religious and social disabilities, and the treatment of the lower castes as impure. Full stop. Next point. Indian society was deeply divided on the issue of caste, and unity would not be possible without dissolving these divisions. Full stop. Next point. Further, the British could also exploit these divisions to perpetuate their rule in India. ठीक है, तो जो भी traditional divisions थे Indian society के, the British tried to exploit them with their divide and rule policy, and the division of the Indian society on the basis of caste exposed the Indian society to divide and rule on the basis of caste distinctions. ठीक है, तो caste related issues ये थे. And finally, the superstitious beliefs and practices. Number 4, superstitious beliefs and practices. Write down. 19th century Indian society was characterized by the widespread prevalence of superstitions, comma, both harmful and benign, both harmful and benign. BENIGN. Full stop. Next point. The presence of the presence of such superstitions indicates a lack of rational thinking, indicates a lack of rational thinking. Full stop. In fact, it is a symptom, of a society that has trained itself, not to question, existing norms, and rather defer to authority, DEFER, defer to authority by default. Full stop. Next point. In such a society, comma, change is almost impossible. Since there are no incentives, to challenge corrupt institutions and practices. Full stop. Next point. Does superstition is both a cause of and a symptom of social stagnation. And civilizational stagnation means civilizational death, because ultimately those people who were behind you earlier are going to outpace you, right? Both socially, economically, as well as politically. They are going to then defeat you, right? So, आपका civilization then comes under threat. You are liable to lose your civilizational identity. So, stagnation is the worst possible thing that can happen to any civilization. So these were the issues that these 19th century reformers were trying to address. Clear है इतना? ठीक है. Next आई क्या था? The ideas. So we are talking about the ideas which inspired the Indian thinkers to bring about their agenda for reform in order to address these issues. So what kinds of ideas do you think were responsible? क्या क्या रहा होगा? अब सोशल इविल्स को, जिनके पीछे रिलीजियस सैंक्शन है, उसको एड्रेस करने के लिए क्या यूज किया होगा इंडियन थिंकर्स ने, रिफॉर्मर्स ने? रैशनैलिटी। ठीक है, क्या मतलब होता है रैशनैलिटी का? व्हाट डज दिस आइडिया स्टैंड फॉर? It stands for the testing of each and every institution, social belief, religious practice on the benchmark of logic. If it withstands this scrutiny, तो उसमें कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, उसको कंटिन्यू रहने देना चाहिए. But if it fails, that means that that system or practice is corrupt, it is broken, it is not desirable, it is illogical, and hence it must be either outright rejected or transformed or reformed. ठीक है, तो rationality. दूसरा, scientific temper. What does this stand for? It stands for the application of the scientific method to all practices and institutions. For example, अनटचेबिलिटी का एक प्रैक्टिस या इंस्टीट्यूशन है, या फिर स्लेवरी का प्रैक्टिस या इंस्टीट्यूशन है, अनटचेबिलिटी कंसिडर करते हैं, राइट? अब इसके ऊपर आप साइंटिफिक मेथड अप्लाई करोगे. व्हाट डज द साइंटिफिक मेथड कॉन्स्टिट्यूट ऑफ? 3 स्टेजेस होते हैं. ऑब्जर्वेशन, हाइपोथेसिस एंड एक्सपेरिमेंटेशन. ठीक है, अनटचेबिलिटी में क्या ऑब्जर्व करोगे? दैट द सोसाइटी इज डिवाइडेड इनटू 2 क्लासेस, द अपर कास्ट एंड द untouchables. That is the basic observation. The untouchables are considered to be impure. अब on the basis of that you form your hypothesis that either, जैसे कि पुराने लोग बोल रहे हैं, this impurity is a question of caste, that inherently the lower castes are impure. एंड मॉडर्न आप एप्लीकेशन, मॉडर्न कोई हाइपोथेसिस थ्योरी बनाने की कोशिश करोगे तो उसमें यू विल कम विद सम बायोलॉजिकल एक्सप्लेनेशन और जेनेटिक एक्सप्लेनेशन, राइट? दैट इट इज इंपॉर्टेंट टू मेंटेन द डिस्टिंक्शन बिटवीन दीज 2 क्लासेस, बिकॉज अगर नहीं करेंगे तो उसकी वजह से कुछ एडवर्स इफेक्ट्स होंगे. एंड देन यू आर गोइंग टू टेस्ट बोथ दीज हाइपोथेसिस विद अ सीरीज ऑफ एक्सपेरिमेंट्स. तो उसमें सिंपल एक्सपेरिमेंट्स भी हो सकते हैं. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, if a high caste individual, upper caste individual is made to eat some food or drink water that has been obtained or prepared by a low caste individual, बीमार नहीं पड़ा, तो ये hypothesis theory बकवास है. कुछ और elaborate experiment भी हो सकते हैं. For example, जो intercaste marriages हैं, if the issues arising out of these marriages, जो बच्चे पैदा हो रहे हैं, अगर उसमें कोई genetic या फिर physical deformities नहीं है, then this entire idea is also बकवास. तो इसको आप डिस्कार्ड कर सकते हो. ठीक है, तो दैट इज द साइंटिफिक टेम्पर. इनफैक्ट दिस काइंड ऑफ थिंकिंग allows ordinary individuals to question their surroundings. जो prevalent institutions या practices हैं, जो systems बने हुए हैं, उनको question करने के लिए ये एक basic equipment होता है. ठीक है, then the idea of humanism. What does this stand for? Humanism. This is the idea that human beings are at the center of the entire world. So human जो society है अपने आप को किस basis पे organize करती है? On the basis of several social norms, चाहे caste हो जाएगा, चाहे language हो जाएगा, और on the basis of a certain religion, तो church हो जाएगा, उसका clergy हो जाएगा, उसका एक वर्जन होगा कि सोसाइटी को किस बेसिस पे ऑर्गेनाइज होना चाहिए, और ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ लीगल नॉर्म्स स्टेट कैन लेजिस्लेट. ठीक है, नाउ ह्यूमनिज्म क्या एम्फसाइज करता है? दैट ये चाहे जितने भी सोशल सिस्टम्स हो गए या फिर रिलीजियस सिस्टम्स हो गए, लीगल सिस्टम्स हो गए, विच आर मेंट टू रेगुलेट ह्यूमन बिहेवियर एंड ह्यूमन इंटरेक्शन, they are not the actual ends. वो केवल जरिया हैं. They are means to an end. And what is the real end? The welfare of the actual human being. So according to this idea, all social exercise, all social efforts, all religious institutions, or all legal codes, all state machinery, उसका केवल एक पर्पस होना चाहिए, that is to maximize human welfare. ठीक है? So human should be at the center of the entire civilizational machinery and not the other way around. So religion का purpose है to serve human beings, not human beings to serve religion. It is the purpose of the society and its norms to serve individual benefits, individual welfare, not the other way around. It is the purpose of the state to serve the individual human being, not the other way around. तो ये emphasis भी बहुत important था behind this entire agenda for reform. And finally, the modern Western political ideas which emerged from events such as the French Revolution or the American Revolution, such as liberty, equality, fraternity, limited government, popular sovereignty, right? Because उनका basis ही पूरा enlightenment वाला है. Rationality, scientific temper और humanism पे based है, because the West had already experimented with these ideas and through a long process of trial and error, it had distilled these ideas into their political manifestations such as equality, liberty, fraternity, जो हमने भी mention किए. So that is why the Indian reformers were also inspired by these Western ideas, Western political ideas. ठीक है? तो एक एक करके इनको थोड़ा सा लिख लेते हैं. Number 1, write down rationality. Rationality. लिखो. It stands for the application. It stands for the application of reason or logic to every situation, and on the basis of this, to evaluate prevailing institutions, norms, and practices. Full stop. Next point. If they withstand this scrutiny, comma, they should be allowed to continue. Full stop. But if they fail, comma, they must be discarded or reformed. ठीक है? Number 2, scientific temper. It involves the encouragement of free thinking and critical thinking by popularizing the application of the scientific method. Scientific methods के बाद within brackets, right? Observe, hypothesize, experiment. Hypothesize, experiment. Observe, hypothesize, experiment. To social problems. Bracket close. To social problems. Application of popularizing the application of the scientific method to social problems. Full stop. In this way, comma, the people can be trained to challenge unfair norms and transform the society. ठीक है? This is scientific temper. Third, humanism. देखो, this idea emphasizes that individual humans should be at the center of all social, religious, and legal structures. Full stop. Next point. Essentially, human welfare should be the priority of all collective endeavors. Full stop. Next point. This value change could become the basis for a fairer, just, and equal society. Where human dignity would enjoy the highest priority. Full stop. Highest priority. Next point. It would also automatically dissolve the traditional civilizational structure based on collectivism, deism, and statism. Deism is a structure and ideology which emphasizes upon the primacy of religion over human interest, over individual interest. Statism emphasizes upon the primacy of the state interest over the individual interest, and collectivism emphasizes upon the primacy of social interest. That means the interest of the entire society versus the interest of the individual human being. तो यहाँ पर ह्यूमन वेलबींग, ह्यूमन हैप्पीनेस को सैक्रिफाइस कर दिया जाता है इन परस्यूट ऑफ दीज interests, right? But if humanism becomes the basis for the civilizational structure, then ये बाकी जो भी हैं अपने आप ऑटोमेटिकली अंडरमाइन हो जाएंगे. एंड रिजल्ट क्या होगा? A happier society constituted of happier individuals who are living with dignity. That is the end goal. And number 4 लिखो, modern western political ideas. Modern western political ideas. Modern western political ideas. Write down. These include ideas such as liberty, equality, fraternity, nationalism, popular sovereignty, limited government, etc. etc. Full stop. Next point. These are the core ideas. These are the core ideas of the Enlightenment. These are the core ideas of the Enlightenment, which were responsible for modernizing the West. For modernizing the West, which were responsible for modernizing the West. And could similarly modernize India. And could similarly modernize India. ठीक है? And could similarly modernize India. Is this much clear? So these were the ideas that were responsible for this intellectual awakening. Now एक दूसरा question emerge होता है, how did these ideas spread across India? How were they popularized among the Indian intellectuals as well as the general public? तो किस जरिए से इंडिया पहुंचे ये आइडियाज? एक सब हेडिंग लिखो, हाउ डिड these ideas spread in India? बताइए इन आइडियाज का स्प्रेड कैसे हुआ? पहले तो कई सारे इंडियन एलिट्स यूरोप गए, अमेरिका गए, वहां पे तालीम हासिल करी और फिर वापस इंडिया आए. Their time in the West brought them face to face with the Western civilization. They could easily compare it with the Indian civilization. They could make note of the differences and imbibe the thinking of the West. These ideas were imbibed by them. Upon returning to India, they desired to transform the Indian society on the basis of the Western civilization. Write down number 1. rising contact with the West, rising contact with the West, including the growing number of Indians traveling abroad, growing number of Indians traveling abroad for education and commerce, education and commerce. कुछ बिजनेस करने जाते थे, कुछ पढ़ाई करने जाते थे. Full stop. They brought these ideas back to India. They brought these ideas back to India. और किस तरह के जरिए होंगे? Number 2, the spread of modern Western education. The spread of modern Western education in India. ठीक है? तो Western education based on Western civilization, Western ideas. So through this education, India में भी same consciousness develop होगा. Third right, the introduction of Western scientific and social science literature. Western scientific and social science literature. Especially after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, a large amount of scientific and social science literature exploded onto the scene. This process accelerated after the French Revolution as well. तो अब political philosophy के ऊपर भी नए ideas emerge होने लग जाएंगे. कई सारी books publish होंगी. They were brought to published in India as well. ठीक है? So Western science as well as Western social science, political ideas, philosophical ideas, they were popularized among Indians. And fourthly, how were these ideas made mainstream? Common people तक कैसे पहुंचे? एक नए मीन्स ऑफ मास कम्युनिकेशन के थ्रू. कौन सा? The printing press, newspapers. Write down. The growth of the press in India resulted in the mainstreaming of these ideas. ठीक है? तो जो ये न्यूज़पेपर्स और मैगजीन्स के एडिटर्स, ओनर्स, पब्लिशर्स वगैरह होते थे, which class do you think they belong to? Did they belong to India's traditional feudal class or the middle class urban intelligentsia? Middle class urban intelligentsia. They were heavily inspired by the West, its philosophy, the modern way of thinking. They were deeply critical of the problems within the Indian society. तो उनको openly criticize भी करते थे. They showed their weaknesses also, and they made a very strong case for the reformation of the Indian society. ठीक है? So that is how these ideas were mainstreamed. Clear? तो ये जरिया था कि जिससे ये आइडियाज इंडिया के अक्रॉस स्प्रेड हुए. सो दिस इज द आइडियाज. इश्यूज, आइडियाज हम एड्रेस कर चुके हैं. नेक्स्ट वी हैव इंडिविजुअल्स and their institutions. At the beginning of this lecture, I had given you 6 names of individuals and institutions. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Sir Sayyid, the Wahhabi movement, Arya Samaj, the Jyotiba Phule and Vivekanand, Swami Vivekanand. But इनके जो रिफॉर्म मूवमेंट से इनका जो अप्रोच था सेम नहीं था, अलग अलग था. ठीक है. इनफैक्ट ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ अप्रोच we can divide these individuals and institutions, these reformers and their movements into basically three categories. एक को आप बोल सकते हैं लिबरल्स और रिफॉर्मर्स. एक को आप बोल सकते हैं दी conservatives or revivalists, and the third are the social servants. ठीक है. बेसिस ऑफ डिस्टिंक्शन क्या है? What is the basis of distinction between them? Approach. All of them were trying to address the same set of issues, लेकिन सबका अप्रोच अलग अलग. ठीक है. रिफॉर्मर्स में we can include the names of Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan. ठीक है. Revivalists में we can include the Wahhabi movement and the Arya Samaj of Swami Dayanand Saraswati. And among social servants we can include Jyotiba Phule and his Satya Shodhak Samaj, along with Swami Vivekanand and his Ramakrishna mission. ठीक है. अब बताओ कि तीनों के जो अप्रोच हैं उनमें फर्क क्या है? नाम में भी आपको कुछ क्लूज मिल जाएंगे. इनको बोला जाता है रिफॉर्मर्स. दे आर कॉल्ड दी रिवाइवलिस्ट्स. रिफॉर्मर्स की कोशिश क्या होगी? जो एंशिएंट इंडियन सिस्टम्स थे उनमें कुछ नेसेसरी चेंजेस लाना या फिर एग्जैक्टली उन एंशिएंट सिस्टम्स को रिवाइव कर देना, चेंजेस लाना. राइट. तो प्रॉब्लम है सोशल इश्यूज का, सोल्यूशन क्या निकालेंगे? अ कॉम्बिनेशन ऑफ इंडियन एंड वेस्टर्न रेमेडीज. तो जो सिविलाइजेशन मशीनरी इंडिया का ब्रोकन है उसमें कुछ पुराने पार्ट्स के मॉडल लगाएंगे और कुछ कंप्लीटली नए मॉडल लगाएंगे. तो यानी कि मर्ज को ट्रीट करने के लिए पार्टली आयुर्वेदिक पार्टली एलोपैथिक ट्रीटमेंट हो रहा है. ठीक है. रिवाइवलिस्ट्स ऑन द अदर हैंड वो क्या एम्फसाइज करेंगे? Go back to the ancient tradition. Ancient society was the ideal society. स्वामी दयानंद सरस्वती क्या बोलेंगे? Go back to the Vedas. तो यहाँ पे सोल्यूशन क्या होगा? केवल और केवल इंडियन रेमेडीज, नो वेस्टर्न रेमेडीज. जो सिविलाइजेशनल मशीनरी डिफॉर्म हो चुका है उसको पुराने मॉडल के बेसिस पे ही रिपेयर करने की कोशिश करेंगे, ठीक है। उसमें कुछ भी नया इनोवेशन ये लोग अवॉइड करेंगे। एंड सोशल सर्वेंट्स ऑन द अदर हैंड, उनका ऑब्जेक्टिव सोशल रिफॉर्म लाना नहीं होगा, सिविलाइजेशन स्ट्रक्चर को रिपेयर या रिफॉर्म करना नहीं होगा, रादर it would be to emancipate those sections of the population which are suffering, such as the untouchables or the poor or the sick or the destitute, widows etc. ये सोशल सर्विस ह्यूमैनिटेरियन एड प्रोवाइड करेंगे। किसी इलाके में स्कूल नहीं है तो वहां स्कूल बना देंगे, कहीं पे हॉस्पिटल की जरूरत है तो वहां पे हॉस्पिटल बना देंगे, डॉक्टर्स को ऑर्गेनाइज करेंगे, मेडिसिन प्रोवाइड करेंगे, कहीं पे फैमिन अगर स्ट्राइक किया है तो वहां पे फैमिन रिलीफ प्रोवाइड करेंगे, शेल्टर बनाएंगे, फूड सर्विसेज फूड अवेलेबल करवाएंगे, दीज काइंड्स ऑफ थिंग्स। सो इट इज सोशल सर्विस instead of social reform. That is going to be their approach. Is this clear? तो ब्रॉडली इन 3 कैटेगरीज में हम इनको डिवाइड कर देते हैं। वन बाय वन लेट अस एड्रेस ईच ऑफ दीज। सबसे पहले रिफॉर्मर्स को एड्रेस करेंगे, उसमें सबसे पहला नाम आएगा राजा राम मोहन रॉय, एंड इनके इंस्टीट्यूशन का नाम क्या था? दी ब्रह्मो समाज, राइट। अब इनके कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशंस को हम कैसे कवर कर सकते हैं? वी कैन टॉक अबाउट हिज थॉट, his contribution to social reform, his contribution to education and politics, and finally his legacy। इनके बाद इनके फॉलोअर्स ने क्या काम किया, ठीक है। फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल हिज थॉट। What was or what were the sources of inspiration behind his thinking? क्या है ये? First of all, he was a firm believer in the Upanishadic thought. He was also deeply inspired by the Rig Ved. ठीक है? He considered the Rig Ved and Upanishads to be the most advanced expression of logic, right? तो लिखो, he was deeply inspired by the Rig Ved and the Upanishads. He was also a great universalist and was also inspired by the religious scripture of other prominent religions such as Islam as well as Christianity. The element of equality present within Islam was very attractive to him. He was also attracted by the element of monotheism within Islam, and it was the Bible's humanism, its appeal towards kindness, that was very attractive to him. Write down. Next point. At the same time, he was also inspired by the equality and monotheism of Islam, as well as the humanitarian approach of the Bible. As well as the humanitarian approach of the Bible. ठीक है? Next point. इसके अलावा modern rational thought also appealed to him. So write down. Apart from these, he was also inspired by modern Western thought. किस तरह का modern Western thought? Only political thought or both political as well as social thought? Political as well as scientific thought. दोनों इनको अपील करते थे because that was based on rationalism, logic. ठीक है? Modern Western thought, both scientific and political. Both scientific and political. Both scientific and political. ठीक है? Now, while he did consider the Rig Veda and Upanishads to be the supreme form of knowledge, he did not consider them to be infallible. यानी कि इनको भी क्वेश्चन किया जा सकता है on some basic grounds, on some rational grounds. What can be the basis of questioning the teachings of the Rig Veda and the Upanishads? That is logic. ठीक है? If these teachings can withstand the scrutiny of logic, they should be accepted. But if they fail on the benchmark of logic, then they need to be re-evaluated. Okay. Next point लिखो. He considered the Rig Veda and Upanishads to be the most evolved form or thought full stop. But he rejected the idea of the infallibility of the Vedas. Of the Vedas. Full stop. According to him, comma, same point, same में लिखो. According to him, comma, Upanishadic thought can be challenged on the basis of logic. On the basis of logic. ठीक है? So this was his thought. Next, his contribution to social reform. Write down. 1814. He established the आत्मीय सभा at Calcutta to propagate monotheism. To propagate monotheism. Why monotheism? Monotheism क्यों? Because belief in different gods results in religious divisions. If people believe that all gods are manifestations of the same supreme god, तो ये religious divisions जो हैं dilute हो जाएंगे. जो religious barriers हैं dividing the society, they would come down. To propagate monotheism in order to unify all Indians. In order to unify all Indians. In order to unify all Indians. ठीक है? Next, in 1828, he established the Brahmo Sabha, which was later renamed as the Brahmo Samaj. Which was later renamed as the Brahmo Samaj. Full stop. It had the following objectives. It had the following objectives. दो objectives थे इसके primarily. ठीक है? First, that is to purify Hinduism based upon the twin pillars of reason and Upanishadic thought in order to preach monotheism. And second wala tha in order to advocate for social reforms, in order to convince the British government to bring in certain much needed social reform legislations. Okay, so write down number 1 and 2. Number 1, to purify Hinduism and preach monotheism based upon the twin pillars of reason and Upanishadic thought. ठीक है? सब पॉइंट लिखो. On the basis of this, he opposed idol worship, priestly domination, caste-based discrimination, sati, child marriage, polygamy, restrictions on widow remarriage, etc. ठीक है? तो कैसे अपोज किया इन्होंने? हाउ डिड ही प्रेजेंट दिस हिज केस अगेंस्ट दीज इविल्स एंड प्रैक्टिसेस इन फ्रंट ऑफ इंडियंस? बेस्ड ऑन द ट्विन पिलर्स ऑफ रीजन एज वेल एज उपनिषदिक थॉट. वेदास को कोट किया और ये बताया इंडियंस को कि वेदास में तो प्रैक्टिसेस सती और कास्ट सिस्टम और प्रीस्टली डोमिनेशन तो मेंशन्ड ही नहीं है. Idol worship is also not present in the Vedas. So these are things that are impure additions, that are corruptions of the ancient Hindu faith. And secondly, कहीं पे अगर मान लीजिए वेदास में कुछ फॉल्ट्स हैं So he challenged those by the application of logic, that they may have been logical in the time that the Vedas were written, but in the context of the modern society, they should be discarded. हम उनको कंटिन्यू नहीं कर सकते हैं because that is going to harm us in the end. ठीक है? So this was used by him in order to make a case against the social evils in the eyes of Indians. ठीक? Number 2 लिखो. Use his platform. Use his platform as a common platform for like-minded individuals, in order to petition the British government to introduce legislations to address prevalent social evils, to address legislations to address prevalent social evils. ठीक है? What was the biggest success of this platform of the Brahmo Samaj? The abolition of sati. ठीक है? 1829 में he was able to convince William Bentinck to introduce a regulation banning sati and codifying the practice of sati as a criminal offense. ठीक? इसको बैन करवाना इनकी सबसे बड़ी सक्सेस थी, बट एट द सेम टाइम the Brahmo Samaj was also advocating for legislations to reform other practices जो अभी हमने पहले mention करी हैं, such as polygamy, child marriage, giving the right to education for the lower castes, giving the right to education for the women, etc. ये सब चीज के लिए भी वो डिमांड कर रहे थे. बाकी चीजें गवर्नमेंट ने नहीं सुनी, सती को जरूर अबॉलिश कर दिया. सब पॉइंट लिखो. In 1829, the British responded by abolishing sati. Full stop. Next sub point. However, other evils such as prohibition of widow remarriage, female infanticide, child marriage, etc. would continue. Child marriage, etc. would continue. And were tackled by later generations of reformers who were inspired by Raja Ram Mohan Roy. ठीक है? Some of these issues would be tackled by reformers associated with the Brahmo Samaj or some other reformers who were indirectly inspired by the Brahmo Samaj. ठीक है? तो ये हो गया इनका contribution to social reform. Is this much clear? Next लिखो, his contribution to education and politics. लिखो, राजा राम मोहन रॉय was well versed in numerous classical and modern languages. Classical and modern languages, such as classical as well as modern languages, such as Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Bangla, Hindi, Urdu, German, French and English. टोटल कितनी लैंग्वेजेस बताई? 12, 6 पुरानी और 6 नई. ठीक है, क्लियर? Now, not only did he know how to speak in these languages fluently, he also wrote extensively in all of them. Next point लिखो. He simplified Bangla prose writing by removing complex Sanskrit words and phrases from it. By removing complex Sanskrit words and phrases from it. Full stop. At the same time, he also modernized the theme of Bangla literature by introducing several essays and articles on modern issues. ठीक है, इसका क्या मतलब हुआ? हाउ डिड ही सिंप्लीफाइज बांग्ला प्रोज राइटिंग? तो पहले जो बांग्ला था, ट्रेडिशनल बांग्ला, दैट वाज द रिजल्ट ऑफ द एवोल्यूशन of the local dialects of Sanskrit and Prakrit. So it was heavily Sanskritized. So because it was heavily Sanskritized, कॉमन पीपल के लिए बांग्ला बोलना तो आसान था, लेकिन बांग्ला लिखना और समझना बहुत मुश्किल था. दैट वाज द प्रिजर्व ऑफ द अपर क्लास एलिट्स, जो जिनको क्लासिकल ट्रेनिंग मिलती थी इन बोथ संस्कृत एज वेल एज बांग्ला, राइट? तो अब क्या किया इन्होंने? जो बड़े कॉम्प्लेक्स संस्कृत वर्ड्स या फिर फ्रेजेस थे, उनको रिप्लेस किया विद द कलोकियल एक्सप्रेशन. तो ही सिंप्लीफाइड इट, मेड इट मोर एक्सेसिबल टू द कॉमन बांग्ला पीपल. दूसरा काम क्या किया इन्होंने? थीमेटिक मॉडर्नाइजेशन. जो पुराना बांग्ला लिटरेचर था, दैट रिवॉल्व्ड अराउंड प्राइमरीली रिलीजन, राइट? तो वहां पे जो मॉडर्न सोशल इश्यूज हैं, इकोनॉमिक प्रॉब्लम्स हैं, उनको एड्रेस नहीं किया जाता था. he started writing essays and articles in Bangla on these modern issues. ठीक है, so he thematically modernized it also. तो बांग्ला के साथ ये किया. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो. he also published several books including the तोहफत उल मुवाहिद्दीन, in Persian and the precepts of Jesus in English. Tuhfatul Muwahhiddin is a Persian book whose title translates literally to a gift to monotheists. So it is a book that he has written in defense of monotheism, highlighting its virtues and advantages. It has also given a philosophical defense of monotheism. In the precepts of Jesus, he has presented a criticism of modern Catholicism. तो उसमें जो करप्शंस धीरे धीरे सीप इन हो गए हैं उसको इन्होंने क्रिटिसाइज किया है. ठीक है, दिस इज रिटन इन इंग्लिश. तो wrote several books such as the Tuhfatul Muwahhiddin and Precepts of Jesus. Next point लिखो. He was also the first Indian to own and edit a newspaper. Own and edit a newspaper. और इनके न्यूज़पेपर्स के नाम, so write down. Same point में ही continue. He published several newspapers such as number 1, the Samvad Kaumudi in Bangla. This was the first ever newspaper to be published by an Indian. Number 2, the Mirat ul Akhbar in Urdu. And third, एक monthly magazine था, the Brahmanical magazine in English. Samvad Kaumudi in Bangla, Miratul Akhbar in Urdu, and Brahmanical magazine in English. ठीक है. Next point लिखो. He was also a pioneer. Of modern education. और एजुकेशन में इनके दो सबसे बड़े कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशंस थे. राइट डाउन सब पॉइंट्स में. नंबर 1, in 1817 he set up the Hindu College at Calcutta alongside Alexander Duff, DUFF, and David Hare, HARE. David Hare. Full stop. He taught history and literature at this college. And number 2, in 1825 he established his Vedant College at Calcutta, where he introduced new subjects such as mechanics and Voltaire's philosophy. ठीक है. Next point. Mechanics and Voltaire's philosophy. In 1825, he established his Vedant College at Calcutta, where he introduced new subjects such as mechanics and Voltaire's philosophy. Next main point likho. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was also involved in political activism full stop. He raised political issues through petitions and his writings which were published through his newspapers. Petitions and writings which were published through his newspapers. Full stop. These include एक एक करके लिख लो. Criticism of zamindars who were free to exploit the peasants without any check. ठीक है. Number 2, demanding the abolition of the trading rights of the East India Company. Demanding the abolition of the trading rights of the East India Company. Number 3, demanding the Indianization of both the higher and subordinate civil services. Number 4, demanding the separation of the executive from the judiciary. Demanding the separation of the executive from the judiciary and providing legal equality between Indians and Europeans. Equality between Indians and Europeans. Next, demanding the reduction of land revenue and the let's say abolition and the abolition of taxes in tax exempt lands. So he wanted the government to demarcate certain tracts as exempt land. तो वहां पे कोई taxes नहीं होने चाहिए. ठीक है. Next point. He also demanded the reduction of export duties in order to encourage Indian manufacturing. ठीक है. So this was the scope of his political activism. Obviously इन्होंने कोई political party वगैरह नहीं establish किया. His political activism was done at a more personal level. He directly petitioned either to the government or made a case for political reforms through his writings which he published in his own newspapers. तो कुछ चीजों को उन्होंने criticize किया और कुछ जो demands थी वो appeals के form में he tried to popularize them in order to create favorable political and public opinion in favor of these reforms, right? Now, obviously, these were not going to be successful within the context of his own lifetime, क्योंकि अभी जो Indian political movement है, that was still in its infant stage. In fact, infant stage में नहीं, embryonic stage में था. And जो critical mass necessary होता है to trigger reform that had not yet been reached. But Raja Ram Mohan Roy was clearly showing that in his thinking were the undertones of nationalism also. क्यों? क्योंकि बाद में जब national movement formally शुरू भी हो जाएगा तो भी similar lines के ऊपर Indian politicians demands रखेंगे, right? They are initially going to try and force the British administration to reform the political system in India so that the suffering of Indians could be mitigated and their essential demands could be fulfilled. And following the failure of this, they are going to demand Swaraj or self-rule. तो अभी जो early stage of nationalism हुआ after 1885 onwards, उसका आपको एक small window, एक glimpse राजा राम मोहन रॉय के political activism में भी दिख जाता है. So he was clearly able to envision the political problems with India, and he was also able to create a direction, a template for the future generation of nationalists. So write down. Main point लिखो. Clearly, his agenda of political reform carried the undertones of nationalism and served as a template for the early generation of nationalists in the initial stages of the national movement. If you look at these demands, do you find any religion specific or region specific or class specific demand? No. So this also showcases that he had an all India secular perspective, and this was the model that was adopted by the Congress and the early generation of nationalists as well. In the Indian stage of the national movement, in the initial stage of the national movement. Okay? So with this, we have covered his thought, his contribution to social reforms, as well as contribution to education and politics. Lastly, we have his legacy. ठीक है. Now, Raja Ram Mohan Roy died unexpectedly in 1833 when he was in England. तो इंग्लैंड भेजा था उनको the contemporary Mughal emperor ने, शाह आलम दी सेकंड ने, no, sorry, शाह आलम दी सेकंड ने, Muhammad Shah ne, right? And he had gone there in order to advocate that the Mughal emperor's pension, which had been reduced recently, that should be restored. वहां पे I think he contracted tuberculosis or consumption, one of those two, and he died over there. Following this, the Brahmo Sabha began losing energy, losing steam. So there was much need of a new infusion of leadership as well as energy. ये होता है in 1839 में, when Debendranath Tagore set up his own social reform organization known as the Tattvabodhini Sabha with his own magazine, the Tattvabodhini Patrika, and in 1842 both of them merge. 1839 to 42, Debendranath Tagore first raises his Tattvabodhini Patrika, Sabha, and merges it with the Brahmo Samaj. So this gave a new lease of life to the ailing Brahmo Samaj. Following this, Debendranath Tagore served as the Acharya of the Brahmo Samaj. And इनका जो मेथडोलॉजी था वो काफी इंटरेस्टिंग था. He adopted a very strategic approach towards reforming the Hindu society. कैसा? First of all, within Hinduism, the Brahmo Samaj worked to exterminate the prevailing social evils and to create a greater platform, greater grounds for unity. So, reform का agenda था. Clear? Outside Hinduism, क्या मेथड अप्रोच किया, क्या अप्रोच अडॉप्ट किया इन्होंने? To defend Hinduism from external attacks coming especially from the quarter of the Christian missionary and the Western thinkers. ठीक है? So while defending their position, they tried to reform it, strengthen it. तो ये इनका idea था, right? Now, with time, a number of prominent Bengali intellectuals became associated with the Brahmo Samaj. But major turning point next आता है in 1858, when a charismatic young thinker, Keshav Chandra Sen, becomes associated with it. ठीक है? And he is chosen as the new Acharya. Now, there was substantial friction between Keshav Chandra Sen and Debendranath Tagore, on both ideological and personal grounds. Personal grounds क्योंकि ओल्ड गार्ड और न्यू जो ग्रुप है उसके बीच में हमेशा कॉन्फ्लिक्ट रहेगा ही रहेगा, बट मेथोडोलॉजी अप्रोच भी दोनों का अलग था. केशव चंद्र सेन advocated for radical reform such as discarding the caste system entirely, promoting intermarriages between different castes and even different religions, and adopting the best practices from other religions. Now, this radical approach did not appeal to the relatively more conservative faction under the leadership of Debendranath Tagore, and therefore there was a split within the Brahmo Samaj. अब ब्रह्मो समाज में एक स्प्लिट हो गया and two organizations emerged. This split ultimately took place in 1866. इसकी वजह से, डिफरेंसेस की वजह से, देवेंद्रनाथ टैगोर का जो फैक्शन था दैट रीऑर्गेनाइज्ड इटसेल्फ एज द आदि ब्रह्मो समाज, and Keshav Chandra Sen's faction came to be known as the Brahmo Samaj of India. ठीक है. With the creation of the Brahmo Samaj of India, the Brahmo Samaj now started to expand its activities outside Bengal also. ठीक है. So Brahmo Samaj of India ने अपने ही branches open कर लिए in Madras as well as Bombay Pune area, and they inspired a number of Bengali and Marathi intellectuals to begin their own reform associations such as the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, etc. Right? Brahmo Samaj of South India, Ved Samaj, etc. Madras में emerge हुए सब. Right? So now the Brahmo Samaj of India became an all India association and popularized the creed of socio-religious reforms across India. तो कई सारे अब होम ग्रोन रिफॉर्म मूवमेंट्स अक्रॉस इंडिया इमर्ज होने लग जाएंगे. राइट. नाउ दिस story is going to take a very sharp turn in 1878. Now, Keshav Chandra Sen himself had been a lifelong critic of child marriage, right? But when it came to himself, he did something that was highly hypocritical. इनकी एक 12 साल की बेटी थी, उसकी शादी इन्होंने करवा दी 13 साल के राजा ऑफ कूच बिहार से. Both of them were minors. This was done in 1878, following which many members of the Brahmo Samaj of India left and they established the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj. Among the leaders included prominent Bengali political activists such as Surendranath Banerjee, Anand Mohan Bose, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, etc. And Keshav Chandra Sen and his followers introduced an entirely new institution known as the Navabidhan or New Dispensation. The objective of this new dispensation was not so much social reform, rather, it was the introduction of a completely new religion, a completely new dispensation, of which Keshav Chandra Sen was to be the creator as well as the prophet. इन्होंने अपना खुद का एक चर्च भी एस्टैब्लिश कर लिया, and it borrowed religious practices from all prominent religions, including Hinduism, Islam, as well as Christianity. Okay? Obviously, this was not very successful new dispensation. And with the passage of time, the Brahmo Samaj also kept on losing its relevance. Members kam hote gaye, followership kam hote gaye. But by the time this took place, already इसने अपने successors बना दिए थे, not only in Bengal but also in Bombay and Madras. ठीक है? So this is the legacy of Rajaram Mohan Roy, and he is rightly considered to be the typical citizen of the new India that he pioneered, that he envisioned. ठीक? तो very quickly इसको लिख लो, legacy को write down. Following Ram Mohan Roy's death in 1833, comma, the Brahmo Samaj underwent multiple stages of evolution and schisms, multiple stages of evolution and schisms, SCHISMS, of evolution and schisms. Full stop. It lost relevance by the late 19th century. It lost relevance by the late 19th century, but not before preparing the stage for the next generation of reformers by creating its ideological successors across India. Full stop. These include, next point, these include organizations such as the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, comma, the Paramhans Mandali, comma, the Ved Samaj, and the Brahmo Samaj of South India, etc. Next point. After Rajaram Mohan Roy, The most prominent leaders of the Brahmo Samaj were Debendranath Tagore and Keshav Chandra Sen. Full stop. Sub point. While Debendranath Tagore adopted a strategic approach to reform involving approach to reform. While Debendranath Tagore adopted a strategic approach to reform involving A and B. A, working to reform the Hindu society within Hinduism, or B, defending Hindus or defending Hinduism from external challenges or from external attacks, especially by Christian missionaries. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो, ये दो हट गए, अब पहले वाले का पॉइंट कंटिन्यूएशन. ऑन द अदर हैंड केशव चंद्र सेन मेन पॉइंट नहीं, जैसे आपने लिखा ना वाइल देवेंद्रनाथ टैगोर अडॉप्टेड अ स्ट्रेटेजिक अप्रोच, तो उसी के सेम वाले में लिखो. ऑन द अदर हैंड केशव चंद्र सेन adopted a radical approach, including ABC. A, the complete discarding of the caste system. B, promoting intercaste and interreligious marriages. And C, adopting the best practices from all religions. The best practices from all religions. Next main point likho. In this way, comma, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and his successors created a template for other reformers. So in the history of socio-religious reform movements, जो experiments राजा राम मोहन रॉय ने, देवेंद्रनाथ टैगोर और केशव चंद्र सेन ने किए regarding their approach, their methodology for reform, they were the same techniques and methods that were adopted by others also. तो किसी ने राजा राम मोहन रॉय का अप्रोच लिया, किसी ने देवेंद्रनाथ टैगोर का, किसी ने केशव चंद्र सेन का, with differing results. ठीक है, एक क्वेश्चन लिखो. समझ में आया है लेगेसी? Raja Ram Mohan Roy was the type was the type and pioneer of the new India that he envisioned. Elaborate. क्वेश्चन का मतलब क्या है कि राजा राम मोहन रॉय ने जिस नए हिंदुस्तान की कल्पना की, जो नया इंडिया इन्होंने इमेजिन किया, उसके ये पायनियर भी थे, दैट मीन्स फाउंडर भी थे, as well as type भी थे, that is typical citizen भी थे. So through the works, thoughts and achievements of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, you have to showcase three things. That first of all, he envisioned an entirely new India which was distinct from the traditional India. That he was a pioneer, that he actively worked towards creating this new India, and that he was the typical modern citizen of the new India that was in his dreams. ठीक है, so that is what you have to showcase over here. समझ में आया है? Will you be able to address this? कोशिश करेंगे? ठीक है, तो ये हो गया राजा राम मोहन रॉय एंड दी ब्रह्मो समाज. बाकी जो सोशल रिफॉर्मर्स हैं वो कल की क्लास में कवर करते हैं. ठीक है, एनी डाउट्स गाइज? एक मिनट. Social reform, second point. Social reform, can you be more specific, Pratik, please? Contribution to social reform जरा दिखाना राजा राम मोहन रॉय का. यहाँ से. Okay. In 1828, he established the Brahmo Sabha, which was later renamed as the Brahmo Samaj. It has the following objectives. Achha. Use this platform as a common platform for like-minded individuals in order to petition the British government to introduce legislation to prevent social evils. Use his platform as a common platform for like-minded individuals to petition the British government to introduce legislation to prevent social evils. To introduce legislation to prevent social evils. ठीक है प्रतीक? All right. Anything else? नहीं? चलिए. Thank you. लीजिए. चलिए then. Thank you for your time. कल मिलते हैं.